You are listening to the JJG Podcast.
Hey, welcome to the podcast. Today's podcast, I want to talk a little bit about some things that have been mentioned recently in the media from other fan bases, from sports analysts, even other coaches. You know, the Georgia Bulldogs recently just had this huge NFL draft class. They drafted 15 players to the NFL, set a new record. And there's a lot of questions about, the number one draft pick, and because it wasn't who the analysts had predicted or projected, then, to have that many players drafted from one team, of course, that's going to grab, people's attention. So there's been, some naysayers and some negativity out about the number of players and, which players got drafted and so forth, which I kind of find ludicrous due to the fact that, these players have put in their time and, their job is to go out and try to get drafted, and it's up to these general managers from these NFL teams to decide which players they want to pick. It's not based on what some sports analysts want or some, projection or model that somebody puts out there. But nevertheless, like I said, that information's been out in the media. Also, other schools and other fan bases, have also said that, hey, with Georgia losing so much talent, it's probably a one and done, similar to LSU winning with Joe Burrow and so forth. And then the following season, they kind of, took a hiatus from being relevant. So they feel like, Georgia's going to do the exact same thing. One of the biggest things is they keep mentioning that it took 41 years to win a national championship, which it did. But I do believe that there are fan bases that are also out there that would love to see Georgia just completely fail. And what I mean by that is that, going to the 2022 season, at the end of the season, come out with a record of like a 7-5 or, something where they don't get back to the SEC championship, so they can kind of use their talking points to say, we told you so, that you guys were kind of a one and done team. I do believe that Georgia will certainly suffer and take a step back on defense. I mean, you can't lose that many great defensive line players to the NFL and come back with a potent defense that next year, unless you're playing with a ton of undergrads on that line, which in this case there was some, but not a lot. So I do expect for that. And what I mean by that is I think that it's going to take them a while to gel and to conform. But by the end of the season, I still think that Georgia will probably have a top 10 defense. I don't see Coach Kirby Smart allowing that team to take too far a step back. I mean, he's a guru when it comes to defenses, and, having Will Muschamp and Glenn Schumann, Trey Scott, my expectation, those guys are going to do the right things for that defense. I also think that, when you think about it, skeptics are going to do what skeptics are going to do. Haters are going to do what haters are going to do. That's just, what they do. But if you look at Coach Smart in his 6 years, and I'm going back to, first of all, the comments made about the 41 years, and that's true. It took Georgia 41 years to win a national championship. But Coach Smart's only been there 6 years. And if you think about what he's done in his 6 years, he's gotten Georgia to 2 national championships. And, quite honestly, in my opinion, if we'd called the right offensive plays and would have been more focused and poised in that first championship game back in, I think it was 2018 against Alabama, Georgia may have won that game. But this past season, 2021, they played against Alabama again, and they did come out on top, winning that game 33-18. So in 6 years, he's gotten them to, 2 national championship games. He's also, when you think about it, he's won an SEC championship. He's won the SEC East Division 4 different times. I think they played in 6 bowl games. I think they've probably lost 2 bowl games. I think his record is like 66-15 overall. So he's done a good job there at Georgia in his short tenure there, especially if you compare his first 6 seasons to some of the other big name coaches that's coaching college football today. With that being said, I think that, Coach Smart came in with a lot of experience, right? Coming from Alabama, and his game was defense, right? And to be the defensive coordinator at Bama, winning championships in 2009, 2011, 2012, and 2015, I think it put him in a really good position to understand and know what it takes to build a good defensive team that will put you in a position to win championships, which they proved that this past season. But, as he stated before, to have an opportunity to come back and head coach at your alma mater, it's just something he couldn't pass up. And I'm sure, anyone can, understand that. The other thing I would say is, with all that experience, experiences can be the best teachers. I tell you, from a defense standpoint, you never was concerned with Coach Smart. Initially when he came to Georgia, the offense side of the ball, different thing. I mean, it's not his, it's just not his background. And if you look at their first, 2-3 seasons, and, you could question some of the talent, but I think that some of the things they struggled with was just him being a head coach and, having to make those critical decisions and plays on offense, and the fact that, I know from my personal perspective, I was never, ever happy or satisfied with our offensive coordinators. I didn't feel like they were experienced, that they knew what to do when it came to those big games, and that actually showed to be true. But now you have a sense of more comfortability with their offense, especially having Coach Todd Monken calling that offense, which I think is phenomenal as an offensive coordinator. And if you look at the things he did with, JT, the things he did with Stetson Bennett, and being able to make the right calls and draw up the right plays and so forth, I think that certainly played a huge part, along with the defense, which played the biggest part in Georgia winning the national championship. But at the end of the day, you have a coach like Nick Saban in Alabama who has shown what it takes to be the best year in and year out. Regardless of staff changes, players going to the NFL, getting drafted, transfers, and now dealing with the NIL, he somehow gets it figured out where he can stay competitive and relevant. And that's the reason why that most people each year expect for Alabama to always be in the championship game. There's very few seasons where Alabama, especially recently in the last several years, have not came out as the preseason number one pick. And you could understand that. So you look at like Coach Smart and what he's doing in Georgia, I don't think it's so much that Coach Smart is trying to be Coach Saban, which I don't think he could ever be. But I do think that he has a knack for being a winner. And being a winner doesn't mean that you're going to always win the championship every year, but you have to stay relevant enough where you're always in the hunt. That, at least maybe every couple of years or so, that you're back, in the national championship playoffs and so forth. I mean, I think that's what it's going to take to even be in that conversation and be considered someone as a great coach. I mean, if you think about what Dabo Swinney did with Clemson and winning those 2 national championships, staying relevant for a long time. Now, granted, I'll be the first to tell you, I think the SEC is the toughest conference and the best conference in college football. I do think the ACC is a couple. They're nowhere near the SEC. I mean, after the SEC, I think is the Big Ten. But that's not Clemson's fault. I mean, Clemson puts together a good team, and they go out and they play their game. Now, last season, didn't produce the best Clemson team that we've seen. But my point is that when you look at what Clemson did under Coach Swinney, they're relevant, even though last season was an off season. They're always going to be relevant. They're always going to be the ones that you're going to look at it winning the ACC. In the SEC, you're always going to look at Bama winning the SEC. But right behind Bama, there's Georgia. And I think in Coach Smart's time, he's proven that, Georgia is probably the second best team thus far in the SEC. Now, what I will tell you is that other teams are starting to creep. And when I say creep, they're trying to make their way up to become one of those that are getting their names on the marquee and saying that, hey, you better pay attention to us. Texas A&M, who had the number one recruiting for 2022, regardless of what you think of how they did it, they had the number one. It's probably the best ever according to 247. So, of course, Texas A&M, having Jimbo Fisher, who's won a national championship before at Florida State, he's certainly making that team known that in a year or two, they expect to be in the college football playoffs. Which means, in my opinion, that at some point they have to knock off Bama and win the SEC West. I do expect in the East, I do expect that if Tennessee can get the right talent and can figure out it on both sides of the ball, they'll become relevant again. I also think that Kentucky eventually will get there if they can continue to find playmakers. South Carolina, I do think that they have a very enthusiastic coach. I think they'll win some games that you don't expect for them to win, but I still think they still have some miles to go. Florida, I do think that Billy Napier knows how to win, knows what it takes to win, and eventually he'll get that recruiting to where it needs to be. The question is going to be, as he's doing this, to try to get up to be able to compete with Georgia, you still have that Tennessee, Kentucky, South Carolina. They're doing the exact same thing. So you can't say that, we're going to be the ones that knock off Georgia when you got three other teams that are doing the exact same thing. So those teams know, what needs to be done in order to make themselves relevant, whereas Georgia knows what it takes because they've won the Natty. Now they got to figure out how to stay relevant, right? So they have to continue with their great recruiting, they have to continue developing players, and they have to continue to win. So that kind of puts us in a position that where when you look at the SEC East, which I truly do believe in the next, 3 years or so, we won't have divisions, right? We'll go to some sort of pods, especially when Oklahoma and Texas comes into the SEC conference, which I'm looking forward to that because I think what we will see at that point in time, especially if they can get this thing figured out about the college football playoffs and we can make it a 12-team playoff, I think you can see anywhere between 3 to 4 SEC teams get in the college football playoffs at that time if we ever get to a 12-team playoff. And I'd venture to say that teams like Bama, Georgia, Texas A&M, you would certainly look at them as being relevant. At some point, you got to expect for Auburn to get back to some sort of relevancy, right? You got to expect for Florida to get there. You have to expect for Tennessee. I think Tennessee's got a good coach. I do think that from an offensive standpoint, referencing Tennessee, that hurry-up offense works with the right player personnel. And I think you got to be able to not just manage from a hurry-up offense, but you also have to be able to manage with some other offensive calls also. So I think that's one of the things because teams figure these things out. They just do. They get these things figured out. So, but yeah, I think it's going to get, the next 2 to 3 seasons, especially bringing Oklahoma, Texas, and I think we're going to see a lot more competitive games. The only downside that I see right now, especially having NIL, is the fact that you can have a very prolific player on a team provided they have the right NIL deal for that individual on that particular team. And it can somewhat, I'm not going to use the word balance because I don't think we'll ever see a situation where teams will be balanced based on NIL because all the teams won't be able to offer or have the same NIL sponsors. Right now, if you think about it, Texas A&M probably has the most money in the SEC to be able to offer the best NIL deals. And I think behind those guys, you got to look at, a team like Bama. I think Auburn, Georgia. I know Florida's working on some, not the school, but, some of the boosters and all that. They're putting together some pretty relevant NIL deals. I wouldn't rule out South Carolina or Kentucky or Tennessee especially. But then once you get down to the Missouris, Mississippi State, Vanderbilt, those teams aren't going to be able to compete, competitively when it comes to NIL deals. So, not to mention, we're talking SEC, and you got to remember there's other conferences out there that may be going after some of these same 4-stars and 5-star players. So they definitely have to put some sort of regulations in place, not just, in my opinion, when it comes to NIL, but also with the transfer portal, because we know they're poaching players, and that certainly needs to be addressed also. But we're in an era now where you have fan bases and schools that administrations and all that expect for you to win or at least be relevant, right? And it puts a tremendous amount of pressure on the coaches, puts a tremendous amount of pressure on some of the players. And, when you're a coach, you're basically, bringing in a student or college, athlete with the understanding that we have 3 years basically, because most these players, depending on their draft grade, their junior year, and if they got a good draft grade, most likely they're going to try to go to the league. So you have to make sure that from a depth standpoint that you have players that can fill those voids, not just from drafting, not just from transfers, but also from, God forbid, injuries, right? Because, if you can avoid that injury bug throughout the season and get to the end of the season, if you had a really good squad, you're in a good position. And this is why I say, and if we go back to the beginning of my conversation when I was saying about Georgia losing all these players to the NFL and so forth, there is no honeymoon period. There is no, situation where people in the media or even from the Georgia fan base is going to accept the fact that, well, if we have a down year, it's because we lost X, Y, Z. That could be the case, but it's not the expectation. You just won a national championship. You've always recruited at a very high level. You have a coach that truly understands these defenses and has the experience to do so. You have a very good offensive coordinator. You got good returning players. And if you're developing players, then there is no excuse. There's an expectation. The expectation is not to defend the championship. The expectation is to win the next championship, right? And at least get yourself in a position where you can get to the conference championship game and be the best you can be with the expectation of getting into the college football playoffs. One thing I could say about Coach Smart, he's a coach I would not bet against. He doesn't make excuses. He knows how to get this done. And so for all the haters, the naysayers, and the ones that continue to question his ability to get things done, all I would say is that in 6 seasons, he has a record of 66-15. He's been to 2 college football playoffs. He's won one against one of the best coaches ever. And I would say, if you go back and look at your team, your favorite team, look at history, look at what other coaches have done in their first 6 years, that I would say Coach Smart is probably ranked very high to what he's accomplished. And my expectations for him to even get better going forward. Will there be challenges? Of course. Will there be other teams that will come in to try to disseminate that program by, taking coaches from that staff, and players continue to get poached for transfers and the recruiting battle continues to grow? Of course it will. But like I said earlier, Coach Nick Saban has proven that when you're a true winner, you figure those things out. And he's done it, year in and year out. And like I said before, I'm not trying to compare Coach Smart to Coach Saban because I don't think you can compare it. What I can say is we're in the year of 2022, and we have to focus on the season of 2022. Things change. There's always these different anomalies that you have to address, and you got to figure them out. And I know for sure that Coach Saban has got it figured out. He'll continue to get it figured out. I feel like Coach Smart will figure it out. I feel like there's other coaches in the SEC that will eventually figure it out, but it's always going to be a challenge. And right now, if you ask me today, based on what I've seen, at the end of the season, barring any major injuries, although scarred and bruised, I do expect for Alabama and Georgia to be in the SEC championship. I know there's a revenge factor, not so much for the SEC championship game for Bama as it would be for Georgia. But I do know there's a revenge factor for for Bama when it comes to the national championship game. So I expect for Bama to play some of their best football throughout the season. Doesn't mean they're not going to run into any challenges, because every time Bama plays, especially some of the more higher prolific teams, they're coming after you, right? It's going to be the same thing for Georgia. I mean, every game that Georgia, their first game this year is against Oregon. Oregon's not going to take a seat back because Dan Lanning's their head coach, and he was, formerly at Georgia. Oregon wants to win just as bad as Georgia, and then you got South Carolina on the road. It's going to be a test. I mean, because they want to win. That crowd's going to be in that game. So Georgia's just going to have to address that one pretty quickly, in my opinion, to keep the crowd out of the game. You have Auburn at home, which Georgia has an advantage there. But you got Tennessee at home. Tennessee's going to be a good challenge at home because of the returning quarterback and his ability to make plays. And at the end of the season, you still got Florida, and Florida's always one of those iffy games. It just depends on how good both teams are playing and where you stand injury-wise. But the very last conference game, you're playing Kentucky. And if you look at the time of the season that you're playing Kentucky, and if Kentucky's playing their good ball with their quarterback having a really good season, and if, Georgia goes in that game unfocused, they'll do fine. Unfocused, it could turn out to be, a disaster for them, especially if Kentucky's had a good season all year long, and now you're playing for the East. So those are things you have to take in consideration. Then Georgia has that. They're on the road against Mississippi State, and sometimes you never know where Mississippi State comes in at. Like I said, it all depends on the players, right? And those players come together, they gel together, they stay focused, and they play as one. I do expect for Georgia and Bama to be there, and that's the same for both teams, right? So we'll see what happens. But, once again, I really appreciate you guys listening to today's podcast. That's it for this episode, and thanks for listening.